See you all here, and welcome to Gibraltar, I suppose, as well. It really is very exciting to have so many people come in and to have so much interest about what we're doing at the moment. I mean, Nick touched early on. I'll just kick off by talking a little bit about the background. The gaming sort of side of things, we've seen this before, right? We've seen this opportunity before. We've taken that opportunity before, and we've become that centre of excellence in the gaming field. And two and a half years ago, the government saw a similar opportunity here, and we started to investigate this, look at what the opportunity was in this space if we got this right, and what the opportunity was for creating an appropriate regulatory framework, which at the time was very, very specifically looking actually at virtual currency operators and more specifically in the Bitcoin world. Now, we looked at that and we thought, these are new businesses. We can't try to fit these businesses into a legacy framework as they've tried to do it in some other jurisdictions. We looked at this and we thought, this is a new problem. This is an algorithmic problem. It needs an algorithmic solution. And we looked at approaches that existed around the world. Some jurisdictions approach us and they say, well, let's just apply some simple high-level AML, KYC requirements and that's enough. Other jurisdictions have gone absolutely the other way. I suppose the BitLicense is the best example of that. Really heavily codified rules that are very, very specific, very onerous, but most importantly, almost immediately out of date. So we didn't think that worked at all. The sandbox regimes, like in the UK, run by the FCA, are really excellent, but they are controlled environments. It's a closed loop and a closed system and a closed environment. We wanted to step out of that. So how were we going to do that? We wanted to obviously engage with our local regulator. And when we started talking about this, many people said to me, impossible. How can you, Joey, regulators put the no in innovation, they said. And I said, that's not the case, and that hasn't been the case here. So we started looking at rules that we thought could be valid in 5 years' time, that could provide a safe haven, that could provide legitimacy to this new and very rapidly growing area of business. But how could we do that? We wanted to provide certainty, regulatory certainty. We wanted to permit firms to grow safely. We wanted to protect consumers and protect the reputation of Gibraltar. And we focused on our objectives. What are our objectives going to be? And they're always going to be very much customer focused in that sense. So rather than go down the rule of codifying many different rules and creating a very detailed framework, we created a principles-based approach to regulation in this area. And we defined 9 headline principles. We did that by looking at the world that exists today. We looked at financial services businesses, we looked at other businesses, and we saw the principles that we thought could be applied to firms in this business. Why would we do that? I mean, some people have said, Joe, this is all about disintermediation. Why are you trying to create a regulatory framework around a central operator? Well, again, in our view, the reality is that there almost always is an entity into which you place your trust, and he's performing a function that is relevant to that transactional operation, and it's that operator that we want to regulate and make sure that they are well-run businesses. The most obvious example, of course, is an exchange. So and this is what we spent a lot of time looking at and thinking about. So the framework, just to be clear, moved from being something that just looked at virtual currency operators to this transfer and storage of value principle. So the idea is to create a framework that's only going to capture businesses, operators, intermediaries that transfer or store value belonging to other people. And these are the principles that we defined. Now, hopefully, none of these should provide any shocks. These are 9 headline principles: honesty, integrity, adequate resources, management principles, protection of assets, corporate governance, security access protocols. These are all principles that will then evolve over time and be able to be applied to your businesses in a proportionate way. And that's a very, very key message. And how are we going to provide with these principles in this area? Lots of things are happening. There's new technology, new information available, new systems like coin from a transaction reporting point of view, from a compliance point of view, new systems like Balance from an accounting point of view, offering complete live transparency on an ongoing basis. So because it is a principles-based system, we expect those principles to continue to evolve and bring in all of this new technology as it continues to evolve. Proportionality is a really, really key point. So rather than say, this is a framework and you have to apply it to these rules if you trigger that regulatory requirement, what we're saying is that the principles will be applied proportionately and on a risk-based approach. That means that if you're an exchange, certain principles can be applied to you in one way. If you're a wallet provider, they could be applied to you completely differently. The principles are there, but the rules aren't. It's an evolving piece of legislation. So what's happening at the moment? There's a lot happening. The law comes into effect on the 1st of January. That's a key point. Lots of jurisdictions are talking about this. Everyone is saying they want to do this. Everyone is saying that they have a new way of doing this. No one's actually doing it, and this will be the first framework that comes into effect. And we distinguish ourselves from other jurisdictions where they're offering sort of registrations and simple processes like that. This is a full legal and regulatory framework for operators in this area. The authorizations process has been agreed. There are guidelines that are going to help people define those principles and how to comply with those principles. Authorization fees are also agreed and published, and there are different complexity categorizations that you'll fall into. Transition provisions are also agreed. So that means that if you're an operator that is running that business today from Gibraltar, you will fall into a transition period, so you will be able to continue to operate in January, and you will be required to file and apply for your license before the end of March, and you'll also be able to continue to apply to operate, whilst your application is being dealt with. So we are definitely seeing a lot of rush now for people to establish themselves and have minimum operations in place before the 31st of December. The banks agreeing a client take-on process and application process is also critical. There are banks in Gibraltar that now have agreed to provide services to these businesses, and they have defined an onboarding process to do that. That's not to say that they'll onboard 100% of everyone that's doing anything in Gibraltar, but it's critical that they've come along with us on this journey. So I wanted to talk a bit about tokens. I mean, obviously there's a lot of focus on that at the moment and at the conference. It's a very obvious funding mechanism for DLT firms. And just to be clear, the regulatory framework that I've been talking about does not apply to ICOs in their current phase, but there has been a statement that a future set of regulations will come into effect later on that will deal with that more specifically. I think, this statement came out. It's important to note that it was a statement. It wasn't a warning. Every regulator is saying the same thing. Effectively, if you take, a share in a fund and you securitize it in a token, you're going to be caught within a legacy framework. But that doesn't mean that all tokens are always caught in legacy framework. So that distinction has been made in Gibraltar in the same way that it has in every jurisdiction in the world. Now, this is going to be, if you like, sort of DLT Mark II, looking at tokens, and they are looking at a separate framework. It's a complementary framework, and they describe it as a complementary framework. And I think that that's important. A lot of people in the ICO space are now talking about self-regulation, and that's a great thing. It can be a good starting point. Unfortunately, it does not capture the bad actors in the space unless you have a way of enforcing compliance with a certain set of rules. The bad actors are never going to comply with those rules. So we think that creating a framework around this is also important. So token sales in Gibraltar. I mean, I describe token sales or TGEs, etc., as, to an extent, a risk management process. So how do you bring yourself down or lower down the risk scale when you're talking about doing a token sale? So certainty of treatment is absolutely critical, and you have a legal piece to that where you have professionals in Gibraltar that understand this area. You have a regulatory piece, which is dealing with a regulator who also understands the space very well, and in my experience actually understands it far better than most regulators around the world, and trying to provide as much certainty as possible from the legal, regulatory, and tax perspective, which is what we call sort of a bit of a holy trinity. Now, we don't have VAT in Gibraltar, which is unique. We don't have capital gains in Gibraltar. We don't have withholding tax. We do have a common law system, which these principles of equity that exist are also very, very interesting and relevant in this blockchain space. But more importantly than that, I think at the moment what we have is this top-down approach. So the softer factors, you're dealing with a government who understands and is supportive of the area, dealing with a regulator who understands and is supporting, we're legislating in this area. So what follows on from that? You have banks that are understanding of the area, willing to provide that suite of service as well. And I think when you bring all of that together, it's an extremely powerful message.